Some secrets are not buried to be hidden forever. Some are buried until the right heart comes close enough to hear them calling. The night after Thomas Hartwell was laid to rest, the old farm did not sleep. Rain moved across the fields in long silver sheets, tapping on the roof of the farmhouse, running down the porch posts, gathering in the wagon ruts that crossed the yard like tired scars. Caleb Whitaker lay awake on a narrow cot in the front room, still wearing his worn work shirt and jeans, his boots placed neatly beside him the way old habits demanded. He had slept in trucks, church basements, spare barns, and once beneath a highway overpass where the winter wind had sounded like a freight train passing through his bones. But this house was different. This house had walls that remembered people. Every board seemed to settle with a sigh. Every window held the pale reflection of the storm. And somewhere beyond the glass, the fields that Thomas Hartwell had loved were breathing in the dark. Ranger heard it first. The German shepherd lifted his head from the braided rug near the cold fireplace, ears standing high, amber eyes fixed on the back door. Caleb did not move at first. He had learned long ago to listen before he reacted. The room smelled of dust, rainwater, and the faint sweetness of old apples stored somewhere in the walls. Then Ranger rose, slow and certain, not barking, not pacing, only staring at the door as if someone had placed a hand against it from the other side. Caleb pushed himself upright. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Ranger answered with a low whine, then crossed the room and pressed one paw against the door. Outside, thunder rolled far beyond the hills, soft enough to feel like memory instead of weather. Caleb stood, pulled on his boots, and opened the door. Cold rain touched his face immediately. Ranger slipped past him and went down the porch steps into the yard, his body moving with the focused discipline of a dog who had once searched broken places and found what people had missed. Caleb grabbed the old lantern from the hook by the door and followed. The beam trembled over weeds, fence posts, and the sagging outline of the barn. The Hartwell farm stretched around him in shadows, 40 acres of tired pasture, a white farmhouse with peeling trim, a greenhouse cracked at the corners, and behind the house, an apple tree so old its branches bent toward the ground like the hands of someone praying. Ranger went straight to that tree. Not the barn, not the well, not the shed where Thomas had kept tools lined by size and purpose. The dog stopped beneath the apple tree and began to dig. Caleb hurried after him, rain soaking through his jacket. "Easy," he said, though his own pulse had started to quicken. Ranger scraped at the soft earth beneath the roots, careful but urgent, throwing aside dark clumps of mud. The old tree shuddered under the rain. A few late apples lay in the grass, bruised gold and red, shining in the lantern light. Caleb knelt beside Ranger and brushed mud away with his hand. His fingers struck metal. For a moment he simply stared. He had expected a root, a stone, maybe some buried scrap from years of farm repairs. Instead, he uncovered the corner of a flat metal plate, cold and heavy, about the size of a Bible cover. He worked it loose from the ground, wiped it with his sleeve, and held it beneath the lantern. The words were not painted. They were carved deep, as if someone had wanted them to outlast weather, grief, and time. Not beneath the house. Beneath what she loved. Caleb read the sentence once, then again, rain running from his brow into the lines around his eyes. Behind him, the farmhouse windows glowed faintly with the light he had left burning inside, and for a strange second he felt as if the old place were watching him. Ranger sat back on his haunches, wet fur gleaming silver and cream, his gaze steady on Caleb's face. That look was what unsettled him most. Not fear. Not excitement. Recognition. Like the dog had not found a clue by accident, but answered a call meant for both of them. Caleb turned the plate over. On the back, scratched in smaller letters, were two initials E.H., Eleanor Hartwell. Emily's mother. Thomas's wife. The woman whose portrait still hung in the hallway, smiling beside a sunlit orchard in a blue dress faded by age behind the glass. Caleb closed his fingers around the plate, and the weight of it seemed to travel all the way through him. Only 12 hours earlier, he had stood at Thomas Hartwell's funeral under a gray Michigan sky while the whole town spoke in low voices and Emily Hartwell kept her eyes on the ground. Caleb had not belonged among them. He knew that. He had stood near the back, his hat in his hands, Ranger pressed against his leg, while farmers, neighbors, church ladies, and distant cousins gathered around the grave. Thomas had been the kind of man people trusted with keys, harvests, and last words. Caleb had known him only in fragments. A cup of coffee offered without questions, a week of fence work paid in cash and dignity, a quiet place to park when the nights were too cold to bear alone. Nothing that should have ended with an inheritance. Nothing that should have brought Caleb back to this farm with a legal envelope in his hand and the whole town wondering what right he had to stand there. Emily had wondered most of all. Caleb could still see her face in the lawyer's office that afternoon, pale with exhaustion, her brown hair tucked beneath a black wool coat, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Margaret Collins, the town attorney, had read Thomas's will in a voice gentle enough to hurt. The farm, the land, the house, the barn, the orchard, and all remaining contents were left to Caleb Whitaker for a period of 30 days, under one condition: he was not to sell it, transfer it, abandon it, or refuse it until Ranger found what Thomas could not say. At those words, Emily had looked up as if the room itself had betrayed her. Caleb had tried to speak. He had tried to give it back before it ever touched his name. But Margaret had only slid Thomas's old pocket watch across the desk. Inside the case, Caleb had found his own initials engraved so carefully they looked like a prayer. Now, kneeling under the apple tree in the storm, with mud on his hands and Eleanor Hartwell's initials shining beneath the lantern, Caleb understood only one thing for certain. Thomas had not left him a farm. He had left him a question. And Ranger, patient and rain-soaked beside him, had just opened the first door. Caleb carried the metal plate back inside with the careful stillness of a man holding something that did not belong to him yet had somehow been placed in his hands. Rain followed him through the back door in cold beads, darkening the floorboards beneath his boots. Ranger shook water from his coat, then stood in the middle of the kitchen with his ears forward, watching the plate as if it might speak. The farmhouse seemed quieter now, not peaceful, exactly, but awake. Caleb set the lantern on the table and laid the plate beside it. Not beneath the house. Beneath what she loved. The words looked different indoors, sharper in the amber light, less like a clue and more like a sentence someone had carried for years without saying aloud. He took off his wet jacket and hung it over the back of a chair, then rubbed both hands over his face. The house smelled of damp wool, old pine, and the faint apple sweetness that seemed to drift from nowhere and everywhere. On the hallway wall, Eleanor Hartwell's portrait watched from its oval frame. She had been younger than Emily was now when the picture was taken, standing beneath that same apple tree with one hand resting on a wooden basket, her smile bright but gentle, the kind of smile that made a person feel forgiven before they even knew what they had done wrong. Caleb stepped closer to the portrait, the metal plate still muddy on the table behind him. "What did you love, Mrs. Hartwell?" he whispered. Ranger came to his side and sat. For several minutes, Caleb listened to the rain and to the slow creak of the old farmhouse settling around him. He thought of Thomas's will. He thought of Emily's face. He thought of those initials scratched into the back of the plate. E.H. There were many things a person could love on a farm. Land. Trees. A kitchen. A bedroom window facing east. A barn built by hand. But something in Thomas's message felt more personal than that. Beneath what she loved. Not what he loved. Not what they owned. What she loved. The next morning came pale and washed clean, with mist lying low over the pasture and beads of rain clinging to every fence wire. Caleb had not slept much. He made coffee in an old percolator he found beside the stove, then fed Ranger from a dented tin bowl near the back steps. The dog ate quickly, but even then his attention kept drifting toward the apple tree. Caleb stood on the porch with the warm mug in his hands, looking out over the Hartwell farm in daylight. It was worn down but not defeated. The red barn leaned slightly to the left. The greenhouse glass had cracked in two corners. The fields beyond the orchard had grown wild with goldenrod and waist-high grass. A rusted tractor sat near the shed, its tires low, its paint faded to the color of dried blood-orange leaves. Yet under all that neglect, Caleb could see the shape of care. Rows once straight. Gates once oiled. Stones pulled from fields and stacked into careful walls. Thomas had not let the place go because he stopped loving it. Something had stopped him before he could finish what he had started. Just after 8 o'clock, a blue sedan rolled up the gravel drive, slow enough that Caleb knew who it was before the door opened. Emily Hartwell stepped out wearing the same black wool coat from the lawyer's office, her hair tied back, her face tired from grief and a night without rest. She looked at the house first, then at Caleb, then at Ranger, who stood at the edge of the porch with his tail low and still. Emily did not greet him. "I came for my mother's recipe box," she said, her voice controlled but thin around the edges. "Margaret said personal family items are still mine." Caleb nodded. "Of course." He opened the door wider and stepped back, but Emily paused before entering, as though crossing that threshold now required permission from someone she did not want to ask. When she finally stepped inside, her eyes moved over the kitchen, the table, the lantern, and then stopped on the metal plate. The color left her face so quickly Caleb reached for the back of a chair without thinking. "Where did you get that?" she asked. Caleb did not touch it. "Ranger found it last night. Under the apple tree." Emily walked toward the table slowly. Her hand hovered over the plate, but she did not pick it up. She read the words. Her lips parted a little, and for the first time since Caleb had met her, the anger in her expression gave way to something younger and more wounded. "That was her tree," she said. "My mother's. She planted it the year I was born." Caleb waited. Emily swallowed. "She used to say the farm could survive anything as long as that tree kept blooming." Ranger padded closer and sat beside her, not touching, only present. Emily looked down at him and tried to hold herself together. "Why would my father bury this there?" Caleb reached into his pocket and took out a folded cloth, then gently wiped the remaining mud from the back of the plate. The initials appeared again, small and uneven. Emily saw them and pressed one hand against the table. "Eleanor Hartwell," she whispered. Outside, a crow called from the barn roof. The sound drifted across the yard and faded into the morning. Caleb spoke carefully. "I do not know what this means. But I do not think your father left me this place to take it from you." Emily gave a small, humorless breath. "Then why did he do it?" Caleb looked toward the hallway, where Thomas's boots still sat beneath the coat rack, as if he might come in from the fields at any moment. "Maybe because he knew I would not sell it before I understood it." That answer did not comfort her, but it did not make her leave. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the plate, while the old house held its silence around them. Then Ranger rose without warning and walked to the hallway. He stopped beneath Eleanor's portrait, lifted his nose, and gave one soft bark. Not alarm. Not fear. An invitation. Emily turned. Caleb followed the dog's gaze to the portrait, then to the narrow table beneath it. There, among a brass candleholder, a cracked blue vase, and a stack of old mail, sat a small wooden music box Caleb had not noticed before. Emily went still. "That was hers too," she said. Caleb did not move toward it. He let Emily be the one to lift the lid. The music box gave a tired click, then released 3 trembling notes into the hallway, sweet and broken. Ranger stepped closer, ears raised. Beneath the velvet lining, tucked so neatly it seemed placed there yesterday, was a tiny rusted key tied with a faded green ribbon. Emily picked it up with shaking fingers. For a moment, she was not the woman who had lost a father and nearly lost a farm. She was a daughter standing in the doorway of a memory, hearing her mother's song return from a place time had failed to reach. Caleb looked at the key, then back at the words on the metal plate. Beneath what she loved. And for the first time, the farm no longer felt like an inheritance. It felt like a map. Emily held the little rusted key in her palm as though it might warm itself back into the past. The green ribbon tied to it had faded almost gray at the edges, but there was still a softness to the knot, a carefulness that felt like Eleanor Hartwell's hand had just left it. Caleb watched without speaking. He knew enough about grief to understand that some discoveries were not meant to be rushed. Morning light slipped through the hallway window and laid a pale rectangle across the floor, touching the music box, the portrait, and the toes of Ranger's front paws. The German shepherd stood very still, his ears turned toward the back of the house. Emily closed the music box with a gentle click. There were 3 places she loved, she said barely above a whisper. The apple tree, the greenhouse, and the piano. Caleb looked toward the parlor, where an upright piano sat against the far wall beneath a white sheet. He had noticed it the night before, but only as a shape in the dark, one more covered thing in a house full of endings. Emily followed his gaze and swallowed. She played every Sunday after church. Even when she got tired near the end, Dad would open the windows so the sound carried into the fields. For a moment, the farmhouse seemed to remember it. Rain had passed, but droplets still fell from the eaves in slow intervals, steady as notes. Caleb picked up the lantern though daylight had come, not because they needed it, but because old houses like to keep shadows in corners. Ranger led them first to the parlor. The air inside was cooler, carrying the dry scent of old paper, dust, and cedar polish. Caleb pulled the sheet from the piano, and a soft cloud rose into the sunlight. The wood beneath was dark walnut, worn smooth near the keys. Emily reached out and touched the edge, her fingers trembling once before settling. She taught me one song, she said. I hated practicing. I wanted to be outside. A faint smile crossed her face, and it hurt more than tears. Caleb stood back, giving her room. Ranger lowered his nose to the pedals, sniffed along the baseboard, then lifted his head toward the keys. Emily pressed middle C. The note came out flat and tired, but it came. Ranger's ears flicked. She pressed another, then another. The third key stuck halfway down with a wooden clack. Ranger stepped forward and gave a soft huff, then nudged the underside of the keyboard with his nose. Caleb crouched beside him. There is something loose here. Emily knelt too, her black coat brushing the floor. Caleb ran his fingers beneath the lip of the piano and found a small panel no wider than his hand. It did not open with the key from the music box, but when he pressed the stuck key again, the panel shifted. Emily drew in a breath. Inside was a folded strip of paper, yellow with age, sealed by a small piece of tape that had long since lost its strength. Caleb lifted it out and handed it to her. This was her mother's house before it was his inheritance. Some things had to pass through the daughter's hands first. Emily unfolded the paper. On it, written in Eleanor's graceful script, were 4 numbers and a phrase: North Field, under glass, where winter learned to grow. Caleb looked toward the back windows. Beyond them, past the apple tree, the old greenhouse stood with broken panes shining in the morning like pieces of thin ice. Emily pressed the paper to her chest. The greenhouse, she said. Ranger was already moving. They crossed the yard with the mist lifting around their boots. The farm looked different now that the sun had risen higher. The weeds were still thick, the fences still tired, but the place no longer seemed abandoned. It seemed patient. The greenhouse door groaned when Caleb opened it. Inside, the air was damp and earthy, warmer than outside, rich with the smell of clay pots, old soil, and vines that had found ways to keep living without permission. Cracked glass overhead scattered sunlight into uneven squares. Ranger walked between the rows with the solemn focus of a church usher, pausing now and then to smell the floor. Emily moved slower. She grew herbs here, she said. Tomatoes, too. And lavender. Dad used to say she could make anything believe it was spring. At the far end of the greenhouse stood a wooden bench lined with empty pots. Some were marked with faded numbers. Caleb wiped moss from one with his sleeve. These are dates, he said. Emily leaned closer. The markings were not random. 6:10. 8:22. 10:3. Dates, maybe anniversaries, maybe birthdays, maybe doors disguised as ordinary days. Ranger stopped at a large square planter beneath the only pane of glass still fully unbroken. It was filled with dry soil and a tangle of dead lavender stems. He did not dig this time. He simply placed one paw on the edge and looked back at Emily. She stepped forward, the rusted key still in her hand. "Mom loved lavender," she said. She said it helped quiet the house. Caleb found a small hand trowel hanging on the wall and gave it to her. Emily began to loosen the soil carefully, not like someone searching for treasure, but like someone uncovering a grave of memories and not wanting to disturb them too harshly. A few inches down, the trowel struck glass. Together, they cleared the soil from a sealed mason jar wrapped in waxed cloth. The lid had been sealed tight but not forgotten. Emily wiped it clean, and inside they saw a photograph, a small brass tag, and another note. This time, Caleb opened the jar while Emily held her breath. The photograph showed Eleanor Hartwell standing beside Thomas, both much younger, in front of the greenhouse. But they were not alone. Around them stood a dozen people, older men in worn coats, a woman holding a child, a young man on crutches, two gray-haired widows with hands clasped together. On the back, written in pencil, were the words, "First Winter Shelter, Hartwell Farm, 1998. Emily stared at it, confused. Shelter? Caleb felt something shift inside him. Not shock exactly, but recognition approaching from far away. He had seen faces like those before. People trying to stand straight after life had bent them. People smiling carefully because kindness still felt unfamiliar. Emily picked up the brass tag. It was engraved with 3 words, Hartwell Relief Fund. The name meant nothing to her, but Caleb went very still. Years ago, when he had been sleeping in his truck behind a closed feed store, a mechanic had handed him an envelope with a gas card, a grocery voucher, and a note that said only, "Keep going." Hartwell Relief Fund. He had thought it was a church program. He had never known. The greenhouse warmed around them, sunlight catching in the broken glass above like small pieces of mercy. Emily looked from the tag to Caleb's face. "You know this name?" she said. Caleb nodded slowly. His voice came out quiet. "I think your parents helped me before I ever knew who they were." Ranger sat between them, calm and watchful, as if this was the answer he had been trying to lead them toward all along. Caleb did not explain right away, because some truths needed a quiet room before they could be spoken. He stood in the greenhouse with the brass tag in his hand while sunlight broke across the cracked panes above him and scattered over the rows of empty pots. Emily watched him as if she were seeing 2 stories at once, the stranger her father had named in a will, and the man whose life had brushed against her family long before she understood it. Ranger sat near the lavender planter, still as a carved statue, his silver and cream coat bright in the warm glasshouse light. Outside, the farm breathed under the late morning sun. A breeze moved through the orchard, shaking drops of water from the apple leaves, and somewhere near the barn a loose hinge tapped softly, again and again, like a patient finger against wood. Caleb turned the brass tag over. Hartwell Relief Fund. The letters were small, but they seemed to carry more weight than the metal itself. "There was a winter," he said at last, his voice low. "About 8 years ago. I had just come back north after losing a repair job near Traverse City. My truck was running rough. I had $12, half a tank of gas, and Ranger was still young enough to think every stop meant a new adventure." Ranger's ears flicked at the sound of his name, but he did not move. Emily lowered her eyes to the photograph of her parents standing with the people outside the greenhouse. Caleb continued carefully, not asking for pity, only placing the memory where it belonged. "I parked behind a feed store because the wind was bad that night. Next morning, someone had left an envelope under my windshield wiper. Gas card. Grocery voucher. A note that said, 'Keep going.' No signature. Just that name." He looked down at the tag again. "Hartwell Relief Fund." Emily pressed the photograph to her coat. "Dad never told me about any of this. Maybe he thought kindness worked better when it did not ask to be recognized," Caleb said. The words settled between them, not as an answer, but as a door left partly open. Emily looked around the greenhouse, at the broken glass, the old soil, the dead lavender that had still guarded the jar after all these years. "My mother was sick when I was little," she said. I remember hospital trips, whispered phone calls, casseroles from church ladies. I remember Dad selling 2 fields on the south side. I thought everything we had went into keeping us afloat. Her voice tightened, but she did not break. I never knew they were helping other people too. Caleb knew then that the mystery was not only beneath the farm. It was inside the space grief had built between Emily and her father. Thomas had kept his silence so carefully that love had begun to look like distance. Ranger rose suddenly and walked to the back wall of the greenhouse, where vines had crept through a cracked lower pane and curled around an old workbench. He sniffed along the legs, then pawed once at a wooden drawer swollen shut by years of damp air. Caleb and Emily exchanged a glance. He has been right so far, Caleb said. Emily wiped her cheek quickly with the heel of her hand and stepped toward the bench. The drawer resisted at first. Caleb held the side steady while she pulled. Wood groaned, dust drifted upward, and then the drawer slid open with a sigh that seemed too tired to be accidental. Inside lay a bundle of seed packets, a small gardening knife wrapped safely in cloth, and a notebook with a green cover. The cover had warped, but the pages inside were dry, protected by oilcloth. Emily opened it. Eleanor's handwriting filled the first pages, neat and graceful, listing plantings, frost dates, remedies for soil, and little notes about weather. Then, halfway through, the entries changed. Names appeared. Meals delivered. Beds prepared. Repairs needed. A widow named Ruth needed firewood. A veteran named Daniel needed boots size 11. A mother and 2 children needed a safe room for 3 nights until her brother arrived from Ohio. Emily read silently, her lips trembling as the farm she thought she knew widened into something almost sacred. Caleb saw one page dated December 12, 1998. Eleanor had written, "The greenhouse stayed warm enough tonight. Thomas says the barn loft can hold 6 more cots if we seal the west wall. No one should be turned away in weather like this." Beneath that line, in Thomas's rougher handwriting, someone had added, "If we ever cannot finish this, let the farm remember." Emily touched the sentence as if it were a pulse. "Let the farm remember," she whispered. Ranger gave a soft sound and moved toward the greenhouse door, looking back at them. The dog was not finished. They followed him out into the yard, past the apple tree and toward the north field where the grass grew thick and pale under the sun. The land rose gently there, leading toward an old equipment barn Caleb had noticed the night before. It was larger than the others, with gray siding, a sagging roofline, and one wide sliding door held shut by a length of chain. Emily stopped several feet away. "Dad kept that barn locked after Mom passed," she said. "He told me the floor was unsafe." Caleb looked at Ranger. The German shepherd stood at the base of the door, nose lifted, body alert but calm. Not afraid. Listening. Caleb stepped closer and examined the chain. It was old, but not forgotten. Someone had oiled the lock within the last year. Emily lifted the little rusted key from her pocket, the one from Eleanor's music box. For the first time since finding it, she seemed to understand that it might not belong to the past. Her hand shook as she fitted it into the lock. It turned with a small, clean click. The sound traveled across the empty field like a bell. Caleb slid the chain free, then pulled the door open. Dusty air rolled out, carrying the smell of hay, cedar, and something colder beneath it, something like stone after rain. Sunlight entered in a wide golden sheet. At first, the barn looked ordinary: stacked crates, old harnesses, tarps folded over equipment, a ladder leaning against the wall. Then Ranger walked straight to the center of the floor and pressed his paw against a square of boards that did not match the others. Caleb knelt and brushed away hay dust. Iron ring. Hidden seam. Emily stood behind him, holding the notebook against her chest. Above them, swallows moved softly in the rafters, their wings whispering in the dimness. Caleb wrapped his hand around the ring and pulled. The boards lifted together, heavy but balanced, revealing not dirt, not storage, but a narrow set of steps descending beneath the barn into clean darkness. A cool breath rose from below, carrying the scent of sealed earth and old timber. Emily did not step back. Neither did Caleb. Ranger looked down the stairs, then up at them, amber eyes steady with quiet certainty. Whatever Thomas had been unable to say, whatever Eleanor had loved enough to hide and protect, it was waiting beneath their feet. Caleb took the first step down with the lantern held low, and the air beneath the barn rose around him cool and clean, untouched by the dust and heat above. Emily followed close behind, one hand sliding along the timber rail, the green notebook pressed beneath her arm as though it were the last living piece of her mother's voice. Ranger went ahead of them, careful and quiet, his paws making almost no sound on the narrow wooden stairs. The passage did not feel like a cellar dug in haste. It felt built, measured, loved into being. The walls were lined with smooth fieldstone, each rock fitted by patient hands, the mortar still firm after all the years it had spent hidden below the north field. Every few feet, small glass jars had been set into wall niches with candles inside, and though none were lit, their presence gave the place a strange gentleness, as if someone had prepared light for travelers who might arrive long after they were gone. At the bottom of the stairs, Caleb lifted the lantern higher. The space opened into a wide underground room supported by cedar beams, dry and surprisingly warm, with the faint scent of old wood, folded blankets, paper, and earth after rain. Emily stopped so suddenly that Caleb almost turned back for her, but she was not frightened. She was trying to breathe through recognition. Along one wall stood 6 simple cots, each neatly folded with a wool blanket at the foot. Nearby were shelves stacked with canned food, jars of peaches, medical supplies, coats in clear garment bags, boots labeled by size, and boxes marked winter, children, kitchen, letters. A long table sat in the center of the room with 12 mismatched chairs around it. Above the table hung a hand-painted sign, faded but still readable in the lantern glow, Hartwell Haven. Emily covered her mouth. The name seemed to pass through her before she could speak it. Caleb looked at the sign and felt the quiet pressure in his chest return, the same feeling he had known years ago when an unnamed envelope had told him to keep going. Ranger walked to the table and rested his nose against one of the chairs, then looked toward the back wall. Caleb followed his gaze and saw a row of framed photographs. He stepped closer. The first showed Thomas and Eleanor standing in the doorway of the barn, younger, proud, and tired in the beautiful way of people who had given more than they had saved. The second showed the greenhouse filled with people drinking coffee from paper cups. The third showed children hanging paper snowflakes from the rafters. The fourth stopped Caleb where he stood. It was not a clear picture. It had been taken from a distance near the old feed store in town. A younger Caleb stood beside his truck with Ranger as a puppy at his feet, both looking toward an envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper. He had never known anyone was watching. He had never known that kindness had a face. Emily stepped beside him and saw it too. Her voice was barely there. "They knew you." Caleb could only nod. His throat tightened, not with shame this time, but with the ache of being remembered by people he had not remembered enough. He had spent years believing help had arrived from nowhere, like a lucky break, like a small mercy tossed into the cold. But mercy had hands. It had names. It had a farm, an apple tree, a greenhouse, and 2 people who had hidden their generosity so deeply that even their daughter had mistaken silence for distance. Emily moved slowly down the wall, reading the handwritten labels beneath the photographs. Thanksgiving meal, 2001. First furnace repaired. Christmas cots delivered after the flood. Eleanor's last winter drive. At the final frame, she stopped. It showed her mother sitting at the same long table in the underground room, a scarf tied over her hair, smiling at a little girl who had fallen asleep with her head on folded arms. Thomas stood behind Eleanor with his hand resting on her chair, his face full of devotion and worry. Beneath the photograph, in Eleanor's handwriting, was written, "If Emily ever wonders where the love went, tell her it went here." Emily made a small sound, not loud, not broken, just the sound of a daughter finding a door inside the past and realizing it had never been locked against her. Caleb stepped back, giving her room. Ranger came to her side and leaned gently against her leg. She placed one hand on the dog's head and closed her eyes. For a while, The only sounds were the soft tick of the lantern warming in Caleb's hand and the faint movement of the barn above them as the afternoon wind crossed the field. Then Emily opened the green notebook again and turned the pages with new urgency. Near the back, a folded letter slipped out and landed on the table. Her name was written across it in Thomas's plain block letters. Emily did not pick it up right away. She looked at Caleb, and he understood the question before she asked it. He turned slightly toward the stairs. "I can wait outside." "No," she said, her voice trembling but steady enough to stand on. "I think he wanted you here." Caleb remained where he was, quiet as the cedar beams above them, while Emily unfolded the letter. The paper had yellowed at the creases. Thomas had written with the careful pressure of an old man trying to leave nothing unclear. "My dear Emily, if you are reading this, then Ranger has done what I prayed he would do, and Caleb has stayed long enough to find the place your mother called her second heart. I know that will hurt you. I know it made me look foolish, unfair, maybe even cold. But I did not leave the farm away from you. I left it in the path of the one person who would never sell it before hearing it speak." Caleb lowered his eyes, but every word found him. Emily read on softer now. "Your mother believed a farm was not land unless it fed more than its owner. After she got sick, she made me promise that Hartwell Haven would not die with her. I tried, sweetheart. I kept the accounts. I kept the room stocked. I helped when I could. But after she passed, every corner of this place sounded like her, and I grew old inside that sound." There was a long pause. Emily pressed the letter against the table with both hands. Outside, somewhere above them, a swallow called from the rafters. Caleb watched dust drift through the lantern light like tiny gold seeds. Emily finished the page in a whisper. "I chose Caleb because your mother once said he had the eyes of a man who would understand shelter. I chose you because this place was born from your mother's love. I chose the dog because sometimes God gives the truth to the creature least likely to twist it. Forgive me for the hurt. Then decide together what mercy should become." The letter ended there, but the room did not feel empty after it. It felt full. Full of meals served, beds made, names remembered, winters survived, and promises waiting patiently beneath a barn until grief became ready to listen. Emily folded the letter with shaking care and looked at Caleb through tears that did not weaken her. "He did not give you my farm," she said. Caleb shook his head slowly. "No." Ranger sat between them, calm and certain, his amber eyes reflecting the lantern flame. Emily looked around Hartwell Haven, at the cots, the shelves, the photographs, the sign her mother had painted, and the pain in her face began to change shape. It did not disappear. It became purpose. "He gave us her work," she whispered. And beneath the old barn, where the earth held its breath and the past finally spoke clearly, Caleb understood that some inheritances were not meant to be owned. They were meant to be continued. They climbed back into daylight slowly, as though leaving the underground room too quickly might scatter the truth they had just found. Caleb closed the hidden hatch with both hands, careful not to let it fall hard, and the barn floor settled back into place with a soft wooden sigh. Emily stood beside him holding Thomas's letter and Eleanor's green notebook against her chest. Above them, sunlight slipped through gaps in the barn siding, drawing long golden lines across the hay dust. Ranger walked to the open door and looked out over the north field, his ears relaxed now, his work not finished but understood. For the first time since Caleb had arrived, the farm did not feel like a question waiting to hurt someone. It felt like a sleeping promise, tired from years of silence, ready to be woken gently. Emily stepped into the yard and breathed in the afternoon air. The sky had cleared to a clean Michigan blue, and the rain from the night before still shone on the grass in small bright sparks. The apple tree behind the farmhouse moved lightly in the breeze, its leaves whispering over the place where Ranger had uncovered the metal plate. Caleb watched Emily look at the fields, the barn, the greenhouse, the house with its peeling white trim, and he saw grief working inside her, not leaving, not disappearing, but making room for something beside it. "I thought he shut me out," she said. "All those years after Mom passed, I thought he stopped talking because he did not trust me with his pain. Caleb stood a respectful distance away, hands loose at his sides. Maybe he was afraid if he opened the door, everything would come out at once. Emily gave a faint nod. That sounds like him. They crossed the yard toward the farmhouse. Ranger trotted ahead, pausing near the porch steps to sniff the damp boards before settling in a patch of sun. Inside, the kitchen looked smaller than it had that morning, but warmer too. The metal plate lay on the table beside the music box key, the brass tag, the photograph from the greenhouse, and Thomas's letter. Each object seemed ordinary by itself, but together they formed a map of hidden mercy. Emily set the green notebook down and opened it near the back. There were pages of names, dates, expenses, notes about repairs, weather, donated quilts, county contacts, pantry lists, and careful records of who had been helped and how. Thomas had continued the work quietly for years after Eleanor's passing, never enough to bring attention, but enough to keep the flame from going out. Caleb read one entry dated only 3 winters earlier. 2 nights, barn room, older veteran passing through, would not give last name, left before breakfast, took the gray coat. Caleb touched the page gently. He kept going, he said. Emily looked down at the handwriting. Alone. The words settled in the kitchen like evening light. Caleb knew that kind of alone. Not the kind where no one stands near you, but the kind where the work in your heart feels too heavy to explain. He looked toward the hallway, where Eleanor's portrait faced the old music box. He may have felt alone, Caleb said, but he was not empty. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something steadier had entered her face. Margaret needs to see this. By late afternoon, Margaret Collins arrived in her county gray sedan with dust on the tires and worry already written between her brows. She had known Thomas for 30 years, and yet when Emily led her beneath the barn and showed her Hartwell Haven, the attorney stood silently under the hand-painted sign for a long time. She read the letter twice. Then she removed her glasses, pressed them against her palm, and looked at Caleb with the solemn expression of someone watching a legal document become a living soul. He planned this carefully, she said. The 30 days were not a punishment. They were protection. He knew people would pressure Emily to sell. Developers have called about this land more than once. Emily's face tightened. He never told me. He did not tell many people much after Eleanor, Margaret said softly. But he came to my office last spring and said the farm needed 2 guardians. One who loved it by blood, and one who would understand its purpose by hunger. Caleb lowered his eyes. The words did not shame him. They humbled him. Ranger sat beside the long table as if listening to testimony. Margaret opened her leather folder and revealed another sealed envelope. One she said Thomas had instructed her not to deliver until the hidden room was found. This envelope was addressed to both Emily Hartwell and Caleb Whitaker. Emily opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a simple legal outline, not final ownership, not a command, but a choice. Thomas had left a path for the farm to become a non-profit shelter and recovery homestead, with Emily and Caleb as founding stewards if they both agreed. The first fund deposit had already been made from Thomas's life insurance, and the last portion of land he had sold years before. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to repair the roof, restore the greenhouse, bring water lines up to code, and reopen the hidden room properly. Emily sat down at the table beneath the barn, the paper in her lap, and for the first time that day she laughed softly through tears. He left instructions for everything except how to forgive him. Margaret's expression softened. Maybe he trusted you to write that part yourself. Caleb looked around the underground room, at the cots folded with care, the shelves waiting for cans and blankets, the photographs of people whose names might otherwise have vanished. He thought of nights when one warm room would have changed the shape of his despair. He thought of the envelope on his windshield, the gas card, the words "keep going." Then he looked at Emily. I will not take this from you, he said. And I will not let it be sold if you want to keep your mother's work alive. Emily studied him for a long moment. In the lantern light below the barn, the anger she had carried at him seemed far away now, like weather that had passed over the ridge. I do not know how to run a place like this, she said. Caleb almost smiled. Neither do I. Ranger gave a small huff from beside the table, and the sound broke something open between them, not humor exactly, but breath. Emily looked at the dog and then back at Caleb. But he seems to think we can. Above them, wind moved across the north field, bending the grass in long waves. The old farm creaked, breathed, and held its secrets no longer. By sunset, the three of them stood beneath the apple tree where the first clue had been found. Emily placed Thomas's letter in her coat pocket, close to her heart. Caleb set the metal plate back on the kitchen table, no longer as a warning, but as a beginning. Ranger lay down at the roots of the tree, amber eyes half closed, as if he had finally heard the farm answer. And in the quiet that followed, Caleb understood that miracles rarely arrive as thunder. More often, they come as a key in a music box, a name on an old tag, a dog listening at the right door, and two wounded people deciding not to let kindness die with the ones who planted it. The next 3 days did not change the farm all at once. They changed it in the humble way spring changes a field, one softened patch of earth at a time. Caleb rose before sunrise each morning, not because anyone ordered him to, but because the old discipline in his bones had found a new reason to stand. He patched the porch steps, cleared the gutters, carried broken boards from the barn, and walked the fence line with Ranger moving beside him like a shadow made of silver and cream. Emily came each morning after stopping by town for coffee, nails, trash bags, or whatever Margaret said the county forms required. She no longer knocked when she entered the farmhouse. She stepped inside with purpose, set her keys on the kitchen table near the metal plate, and opened Eleanor's green notebook as if it were both a guide and a prayer book. At first they worked mostly in silence. Caleb was used to silence, and Emily had inherited her father's habit of putting grief into tasks. But the silence between them changed as the hours passed. It became less like a wall and more like a porch where two people could sit without having to explain the weather. On the fourth morning, fog lay low across the north field, and the barn looked as though it were floating above the grass. Caleb was hauling old crates from the underground room when Ranger suddenly stopped at the top of the hidden stairs and looked toward the driveway. A minute later, tires crunched over gravel. A black pickup rolled into the yard, newer than anything else on the place, polished enough to look uncomfortable beside the leaning fences and rain-darkened wood. The man who stepped out was Roy Fletcher, the neighbor whose land bordered the west pasture. He was in his late 50s, broad through the middle, wearing a clean denim jacket and a seed cap pulled low. Caleb had seen him at the funeral, standing near the back with his arms crossed and his eyes measuring the farm more than mourning the man. Roy smiled when he saw Emily, but the smile never reached his eyes. "Heard you found some old storage room," Roy called. "Whole town is talking." Emily stood in the barn doorway with a coil of extension cord in her hands. "The town talks when a mailbox leans crooked." Roy chuckled as though they were sharing a joke, but his gaze moved past her into the barn. "Your father should have sold this place years ago. Developers are still interested. Good money. Clean ending." Caleb came up from the hidden stairs and set the crate down without a sound. Ranger stood beside him, ears forward, tail still. Roy looked at Caleb, then at the dog, and the air seemed to tighten by a small degree. "No offense," Roy said, though his voice carried plenty of it, "but farms are not saved by stories and stray good intentions." Emily's face went pale, then steady. "This farm is not for sale." Roy lifted both hands. "Just neighborly advice. Old places drain people dry. Thomas learned that." The name landed wrong. Caleb saw Emily flinch, not because the words were loud, but because they touched a bruise that had not yet finished changing into strength. Before Caleb could speak, Ranger gave one low bark. Not aggressive. Not frightened. A single warning note, deep enough to make Roy step back from the barn door. Caleb rested one hand lightly on Ranger's collar. "That is enough," he said softly, though no one knew whether he meant the dog or the man. Roy's smile returned, thinner now. "You folks think hard before you turn down real money. Sentiment does not fix roofs." He climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving the smell of exhaust hanging in the clean morning air. Emily watched the dust settle along the driveway. "He offered Dad money last year," she said. "I thought Dad was stubborn for saying no." Caleb looked at the barn, the hidden room beneath it, the greenhouse, the apple tree, the house that had carried more mercy than anyone in town knew. "Maybe your father knew the difference between price and worth." That afternoon, Margaret returned with folders, forms, and a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, as she put it. She sat with Emily and Caleb at the kitchen table while Ranger slept beneath it, one paw resting over Caleb's boot. The legal work would take time. Inspections. Insurance. County approval. Repairs. A nonprofit board. Fire safety. Plumbing. A proper entrance to Hartwell Haven so no one had to climb through a barn floor like a secret. Emily listened carefully, taking notes in the margin of a grocery receipt because Eleanor's notebook felt too sacred for modern paperwork. Caleb asked practical questions. How many beds would be allowed? Whether the greenhouse could supply food. Whether veterans passing through could stay one night without a waiting list. Margaret answered what she could and admitted what she could not. Outside, clouds gathered again over the fields, but the light in the kitchen stayed warm. Near evening, when Margaret had gone and Emily had driven into town for more boxes, Caleb remained alone in the underground room with Ranger. He began sorting the shelves by category, coats on one side, canned goods on another, letters and records in sealed bins. On the back of the lowest shelf, behind a stack of folded quilts, Ranger nosed at a loose brick. Caleb paused. "Another one?" The dog looked at him with patient certainty. Caleb worked the brick free and found a narrow tin case tucked into the wall. It was not locked. Inside lay a bundle of envelopes tied with twine, each one addressed in Thomas's handwriting to a different person. Ruth Miller. Daniel Price. Annabelle and children. Unknown young veteran with gray dog. Caleb's hand stopped. The last envelope had no proper name, but he knew it belonged to him. For a long while, he did not open it. He sat at the table beneath the painted sign, the tin case before him, Ranger beside his chair, and listened to the quiet of the room that had once kept people warm through their hardest nights. When he finally unfolded the letter, Thomas's words were simple. "Caleb, if this reaches you, then the farm has trusted you enough to let you in. Eleanor noticed you first, years ago, outside Miller's feed. She said you looked like a man who had forgotten that the world still had room for him. We helped quietly because pride can be the last blanket a cold man owns. I do not know what road brought you here, but I know what I saw when you fixed my fence that winter. You worked like a man trying to repay a debt no one had asked him to carry. You fed your dog before yourself. You thanked the land after a hard day. That was enough for me." Caleb lowered the page and closed his eyes. Above him, the old barn creaked softly in the wind. Ranger leaned his warm weight against his leg. The letter continued, and Caleb read each word like stepping stones across water. "If Emily is angry, let her be. Grief needs somewhere to stand before it can kneel. Do not take her mother from her. Help her find Eleanor again. If you both choose Hartwell Haven, do not build it as a monument to us. Build it as a porch light for whoever is still driving through the dark." By the time Emily returned, dusk had settled purple over the farm. She found Caleb sitting beneath the apple tree, the letter folded in his hands, Ranger lying at his feet. She did not ask at first. She simply sat beside him on the damp grass, close enough to share the silence. Caleb handed her the letter. Emily read it slowly, and when she reached the line about grief needing somewhere to stand, she pressed the paper to her heart the way she had pressed her father's letter before. The first star appeared over the barn roof. The old apple tree moved above them, leaves whispering in the cool air. Emily looked toward the farmhouse, then the greenhouse, then the north field where the hidden room waited beneath honest boards. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start with the roof." Caleb nodded. Ranger lifted his head, gave one soft approving breath, and laid it back down. Somewhere in the deepening dark, the farm seemed less like property, less like inheritance, and more like a living promise that had finally found its keepers. By sunrise, the old roof had become the first battlefield of mercy, not because it resisted them, but because it demanded honesty from every hand that touched it. Caleb climbed the ladder with a tool belt at his waist and Ranger watching from the yard below, his head tilted upward as if supervising work that mattered more than shingles and nails. Emily stood on the porch with a clipboard, reading from the repair list Margaret had helped her make, while the morning sun lifted slowly over the north field and turned the dew on the grass into 1,000 brief sparks. The farmhouse looked tired in that light, its peeling trim and sagging gutters plain to see, yet Caleb found beauty in its wear. A place did not have to be perfect to be worthy of saving. Sometimes the broken edges were proof that it had sheltered real lives. By 9 o'clock, 2 trucks rolled up the drive. Margaret had made calls. The first belonged to Ben Haskins, a retired plumber who had once known Thomas through church. The second carried Ruth Miller, a gray-haired widow with sharp eyes and a laugh that arrived before she did. Emily recognized her name from Eleanor's notebook, and when Ruth stepped onto the porch, she touched the doorframe as though greeting an old friend. "Your mother gave me 3 warm nights here when my furnace quit in January," Ruth told Emily. "I never forgot the smell of her chicken soup." Emily looked down, overwhelmed by the way strangers kept returning pieces of her parents she had never known existed. Caleb came down from the ladder and wiped his hands on a rag. Ruth studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. "You must be the man with the dog." Caleb glanced at Ranger, who wagged once, dignified and slow. "He is usually the one people remember." More neighbors came by noon. Not many, but enough. A young mechanic from town brought tarps. A schoolteacher brought boxes of canned goods left from a pantry drive. Ben checked the water lines and declared them old but not hopeless, which seemed to describe half the farm. Emily moved from person to person with a notebook in hand, her grief slowly learning the shape of leadership. She did not become bright or cheerful. That would have been too easy and untrue. But her voice grew steadier each time someone asked where to put something. Coats in the north barn. Food in the kitchen until shelves were built. Blankets downstairs after Caleb sealed the stairwell. The hidden room could not remain hidden now, not if it was meant to become a porch light. By afternoon, Caleb and Ben had framed a proper access door at the back of the barn, one that led safely to the stairs below without lifting the floor. Emily stood at the entrance when they finished, running her hand over the new wood. "Mom would have painted this green," she said. Caleb nodded toward the greenhouse. "There is probably paint somewhere on this farm." Ranger, who had spent the day moving between workers with calm importance, suddenly rose from his place near the apple tree and walked toward the gravel drive. His ears lifted, but this time there was no warning in his posture. Only attention. A dusty white van turned in slowly, then stopped near the barn. A man stepped out, tall and thin, with silver hair tucked beneath a ball cap and a canvas duffel over one shoulder. He looked around as if afraid the place might vanish if he blinked. Margaret, who had just returned with more forms, went still. "Daniel Price?" she said quietly. Emily opened Eleanor's notebook and found the name with her finger. Veteran. Boot size 11. December 1998. The man approached the porch and removed his cap. "I heard Hartwell Haven was opening again," he said. His voice carried years of road dust and restraint. "I do not need a bed. I just came to say I am glad." Ruth stepped down from the porch and took both of his hands. "You are staying for supper, whether you need a bed or not." A gentle ripple of laughter moved through the yard, not loud, not careless, but healing. Caleb watched Daniel look toward the barn, then toward the farmhouse, and saw in his face the same guarded hope Caleb had once carried like a tin cup in winter. Emily noticed it too. Something in her softened. "My mother wrote your name down," she said. Daniel swallowed and looked away toward the fields. "Your mother remembered everyone." Those words did what the letters, the photographs, and the hidden room had been preparing Emily to receive. She turned toward the house, toward the apple tree, toward the greenhouse where dead lavender waited to be replanted, and the final piece of her father's silence clicked into place. Thomas had not loved her less by keeping Hartwell Haven alive. He had been trying to preserve the part of Eleanor that still fed the world. As evening settled, the repaired roof held its first test when a light rain began to fall, soft and silver, tapping gently instead of pouring through. In the kitchen, people gathered around soup, bread, coffee, and mismatched chairs. No one called it a grand reopening. No ribbon was cut. No speeches were made. Daniel helped Ben fix the pantry shelf. Ruth washed mugs. Margaret stacked documents beside the brass tag. Emily placed Eleanor's green notebook in the center of the table, not as a relic, but as a beginning. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment, watching warmth return to the rooms. Ranger sat beside him, amber eyes reflecting lamplight. Then Emily came over and handed Caleb Thomas's legal outline. "I want to sign it tomorrow," she said. "Not alone. With you." Caleb looked at the paper, then at the people in the kitchen, then at the dog who had listened when the farm was still silent. "Only if your name comes first," he said. Emily smiled through tired eyes. "My mother would have liked that answer." Outside, rain touched the apple leaves and slid down into the dark soil where the first clue had waited. Inside, the old house held voices again. Not many. Not enough to fill every room. But enough to remind the walls what they had been built for. And beneath the barn, Hartwell Haven was no longer a secret. It was becoming a promise spoken aloud. By morning, the rain had passed, and the farm woke beneath a sky so clear it seemed newly washed. Sunlight moved across the north field in slow bands of gold, touching the patched roof, the open barn door, the greenhouse glass, and the apple tree whose roots had kept the first secret safe until Ranger found it. Caleb stood on the porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching mist lift from the grass. Ranger lay at the top step, his silver and cream coat bright in the early light, his amber eyes half closed but listening as always. Inside the kitchen, Emily sat with Margaret Collins at the old table where the metal plate, the brass tag, Eleanor's green notebook, and Thomas's letters had been carefully arranged. The legal papers lay between them, no longer cold documents, but a bridge. Emily had read every line twice. Caleb had read every line once, then set the pages down as if the choice itself required reverence. Hartwell Haven would become a non-profit homestead, not owned in the ordinary sense, but held in trust for those who needed temporary shelter, warm meals, recovery, rest, and the quiet dignity of being welcomed without being measured first. Emily signed first, just as Caleb had asked. Her hand trembled only at the beginning. By the time she finished her name, the pen moved steadily. Caleb signed beneath her, slower, with the careful posture of a man who had learned not to take lightly anything that gave him a place to stand. Margaret notarized the papers, then sat back and released a breath that sounded almost like relief. "Your father would have argued about the paperwork," she told Emily. "Your mother would have fed everyone before the ink dried." Emily smiled, and this time it did not break apart. "Then we should probably feed everyone." By noon, the kitchen smelled of vegetable soup, coffee, buttered rolls, and cinnamon from a pan Ruth Miller had brought and wrapped with a towel. Daniel Price repaired a loose pantry shelf while Ben Haskins checked the water pressure and declared, with great seriousness, that the pipes had more character than sense. A few more neighbors arrived, some curious, some apologetic, some carrying boxes because kindness often begins as something practical in the hands. There were canned peaches, winter coats, blankets, towels, work gloves, old lamps, and a stack of children's books from the school library. Emily wrote everything down in Eleanor's notebook, continuing the same columns her mother had once kept. Item. Donor. Need. Date. Caleb watched her from across the room and saw that she was not trying to become Eleanor. She was becoming Emily with Eleanor's courage newly returned to her. In the afternoon, they walked together to the greenhouse. Ranger led the way, his paws brushing through grass still wet near the roots. The dead lavender in the planter had been cleared away, and Ruth had brought new starts in small black pots. Emily knelt and placed the first one into the soil beneath the unbroken pane of glass. She said lavender quieted the house, Emily murmured. Caleb knelt beside her and pressed soil gently around the roots. Maybe it can quiet the barn too. Emily looked toward the north field, where Hartwell Haven waited beneath the repaired entrance, no longer hidden but still humble. Maybe it can quiet all of us a little. Ranger sniffed the lavender, sneezed once, and sat down as if offering his opinion. Emily laughed softly, the sound small but real, and Caleb found himself smiling before he had time to think better of it. Near sunset, Roy Fletcher's black pickup slowed at the end of the driveway. For a moment, everyone in the yard grew quiet. Roy did not get out. He looked at the patched porch, the people carrying supplies, the open barn, the greenhouse, Emily standing with her sleeves rolled up, Caleb beside Ranger under the apple tree. Whatever calculation had brought him there did not survive the sight of a farm becoming something money could not easily name. After a few seconds, Roy touched the brim of his cap, turned the truck around, and drove away. Emily watched the dust settle and said nothing. Caleb did not either. Some answers did not need to be chased down the road. That evening, they brought the old hand-painted sign from the underground room up into the barn entrance. Hartwell Haven. The letters were faded, but Emily refused to repaint them completely. Just enough to protect what Mom already made, she said. Caleb helped her seal the wood with clear varnish, and when the last brushstroke dried under the soft barn light, they hung it above the new doorway. People stood around in a loose semicircle, not as an audience, but as witnesses. Margaret held Thomas's final letter. Ruth held Eleanor's notebook. Daniel stood with his cap against his chest. Ranger sat directly beneath the sign, looking deeply satisfied, as though he had been appointed guardian of the threshold by powers no one needed to explain. Emily stepped forward, her voice quiet. My parents built this place because they believed shelter was more than walls. I spent years thinking grief had taken them away from me. But it turns out love had been working underground the whole time. She looked at Caleb. And sometimes it takes a stranger, and a very stubborn dog, to lead a family back to its own heart. Caleb lowered his eyes, uncomfortable with praise but not with truth. He thought of the man he had been years earlier, cold in his truck, feeding Ranger before himself, believing the world had narrowed to survival. He thought of an envelope under a windshield wiper, a gas card, a note that said keep going. He had kept going, though he had not known toward what. Now he stood beneath a barn roof in Michigan, on a farm he had never asked for, beside a daughter who had learned her father's silence was not abandonment, and a dog who had heard the truth before anyone else could bear it. Later, Emily came to stand beside him. For a while, they simply listened to the house. It did not creak with loneliness anymore. It settled like a living thing finally relieved of its secret. Do you think they know? Emily asked. Caleb looked toward the dark window, where the porch light glowed over the steps and the barn light shone beyond it, 2 small stars for anyone coming up the drive. I think kindness remembers where it came from, he said. Ranger lifted his head then, ears turning toward the fields. Not alarm. Not mystery. Just the steady listening of a faithful companion in a place that had become home. And in the quiet of Hartwell Farm, with lavender newly planted, soup cooling on the stove, and the first clean bed waiting beneath the old barn, the inheritance finally revealed its true shape. It was not land. It was not money. It was a promise kept across grief, carried by a dog, received by the wounded, and returned to the world as a light left on for the next soul still traveling through the dark.